following on from last lesson, we're going to look at the full life cycle of a star, how it forms, how it dies, and the bits in between. Last lesson we looked at how stars formed briefly. Let's recap that. So we talked about the fact that we have nebula, large clouds of dust and gas in space, and each of the particles in that nebula are attracted to all the other particles because of gravity, and slowly over millions of years they attract to the centre of mass and speed up and get hotter and squeeze into a smaller space, pressure increases, and eventually fusion can take place. So this was the sequence we came up with: nebula to protostar, which is not a star but it's giving out some sort of energy because it's so hot. Fusion takes place once it's hot enough, and that's called a main sequence star, where it's fusing hydrogen into helium. So look at that graphically. We've got the nebula cloud that forms a protostar as it collapses. This isn't to scale, by the way. Nebulas are much bigger than the stars they form. And then the protostar, if it's big enough, starts fusion. If it's not big enough, it doesn't become a fully fledged star. Right, let's shrink that down and look what happens if the star is big enough to join the main sequence and is about the same size as our Sun. So it's burning hydrogen, I say burning, fusing hydrogen into helium. Eventually the core runs out of hydrogen and it can no longer maintain the balance between gravity trying to squash it and the fusion pressure pushing it back out again, and so it starts to collapse further. It may get hot enough to start fusing helium into larger elements if the star is big enough. So stars about the same size as our Sun will do this, and maybe even bigger elements again, depending on the size of the star. But in order to fuse helium into larger elements, you need much higher temperatures. So the centre of the star gets more and more dense, hotter and hotter, but the outer layers of the star, because of the energy being emitted, get pushed off into space and cool down. So you end up with a red giant with a very hot centre but a cooler surface. Again, this isn't to scale, by the way. Red giants are hundreds of times bigger than the stars that form them. We'll see that in a little while later. Right, as the central core continues to contract and burn all the fuel that it can, again, I don't mean burn, I mean fuse. Fuse all the fuel that it can, it runs out of fuel. It ends up as a white dwarf, which is a very hot star, but it's no longer undertaking any fusion. It takes billions of years to cool down and become a black dwarf. What you don't need to know, for AQA GCSE at least, is what happens to the outer layers of the star. So these outer layers of the star form a cloud around the white dwarf, which is called a planetary nebula, and they look rather spectacular. I'll find some pictures for you later. So as I was saying, you don't need to know about that, just for interest. Right, what happens if the star is much bigger than our Sun? Again, for AQA GCSE, you don't need to know what happens if the star is smaller than our Sun, but it's easy to find out if you want to have a quick look on Google. So bigger than our Sun. Now, clearly, I think it's fairly obvious. If you end up with a start off with a star that's bigger, you're going to end up with a red giant which is bigger, so they're called red supergiants. Again, you'll see the scale of these things later. So red supergiants have sufficient material that their gravitational fields at the are big enough that the centre temperature gets hot enough to continue fusion for longer, and they fuse elements up to iron, up to and including iron. Once they get to iron, in order to fuse iron, you need to put energy in. It doesn't release energy, so it's not something the star will do naturally. Once it has fused everything to iron, then it's run out of fuel, and there's no way, even if you squeeze it even further, you can't get energy out by fusing iron. So the star has layers of different elements of different sizes, from the largest iron in the centre radiating out to lighter and lighter elements as the pressure and temperature get less and less further out. But as soon as the central core stops fusing, then all the outer layers collapse in on it, because there's no longer any fusion balancing the gravity. And when that happens, it happens very rapidly. The outer layers collapse in, rebound off the iron core, and fly off into space in a spectacular explosion called a supernova. There's two things that happen in that explosion. One is that the elements in the outer layers get blasted off into space, and the other is the energy released is sufficient to fuse elements fuse nuclei into elements bigger than iron. So we end up with elements which are bigger than iron in the centre of the supernova, which through a different process get distributed through space later on. But you don't need to know about that either. As far as you need to know, the elements that form our solar system were made during supernova explosions, and our sun and the planets that go around it are the remnants of dead stars, or maybe even just one dead star. Right, the story doesn't end there, because the central core still exists, and it continues to compress until you squeeze all the electrons into the protons and make neutrons. From when we did radioactivity, neutrons split into protons and electrons, and the electron was emitted as a beta particle. You can reverse that process, and you can squeeze the electron into the proton and make a neutron. So a neutron star is effectively like a massive atomic nucleus. If you think about how the atom is structured, with pretty much all of its mass in the nucleus, but pretty much all of its volume taken up by the electrons, the electron orbits, then most of an atom is nothing. Well, if you take away the nothing and you're just left with the nucleus, you'd end up with an incredibly dense material. So neutron stars are ridiculously dense, but they're not the densest thing. If gravity is sufficiently large and the neutron star is still unstable, it collapses even further and you form a black hole. A black hole's not a hole, it's not something you can put your hand in, put your foot through or whatever. It is a lump of material which is incredibly dense, and the gravitational field around it is so strong that light can't escape from it. That's why it's called a black hole, because it appears to be a black area in space where we can't see anything being emitted. Right, so that's what you need to know for GCSE. And you need to be able to describe that process. You need to memorise and describe the process. So a question might be something like, describe what happens to a star about the same size of our sun once it leaves the main sequence, or something like that. And you'll have to write a 4 or a 6 mark answer along those lines. So you need to memorise the process, memorise the sequence, and the names of the different stages. Right, let's look at scale, and then we're done for this week. So you remember that diagram from last week, the scale of the planet's diameters against the sun. The sun's just peaking in the left-hand side. We've got Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, etc., etc., and the moon going around the Earth. And I said last week that the sun is a fairly average star. In fact, it's quite a small star. So if we look at one of the other stars that we can see from Earth, in fact, the brightest star we can see from the northern part of the Earth, it looks like that compared to the sun. You might just be able to see the planets there as a little bit of a smudge, but they're tiny. The pole star, or the North Star, is a bit bigger again, but even those large stars pale into insignificance when you compare them to what the sun will become as a red giant. So there's the sun as a red giant. you might just be able to see a yellow spot there where the sun is, tiny. But even that isn't very big compared to some of the other red giants in space. So Betelgeuse is a red giant in Orion, and that's significantly larger than the sun will be. But even that is tiny compared to some of the red supergiants. Okay, and that Stephenson 218 is the largest listed star that I could find on the list that I was looking at, and it is enormous, thousands of times bigger than the sun. Anyway, see you next week.